to our panelists. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks for being here.
Yes, we're glad
Would you want to advance the slide?
Why isn't it going?
Well, hello to my colleagues. It's so good to be with you, my co-authors of our book, Teaching for Racial Equity, Becoming Interrupters. And so we'll go ahead and get started. Hello, thank you for joining us today. And my name is Tonya Perry, and I'm the Vice Provost at Miles College in the Birmingham, Alabama area. And I'm a teacher educator and have been doing this work for a number of years in the field. And there I go on the screen. And Katy, you'll be next after me.
And I'm Katy Smith. I, as a 20-year veteran of high school teaching, I'm now in my 20th year at Northeastern Illinois University, where I am the chair of the Department of Educational Inquiry and Curriculum Studies. I oversee all of the secondary education programs, and I am the director of graduate studies this year as well. And Steve, let's turn it to you.
First of all, apologies to people. My screen froze for a minute. I'm the operator of the slides. And along with that, I'm Steve Zemelman. I'm founder and director of the Illinois Writing Project. I founded it a bunch of years ago, and now I'm director with Katy Smith. I'm a scholar in residence at Northeastern Illinois University, where Katy is also teaching. I've done a lot of things over my career. One is that I have written a number of professional books for teachers, usually with partners like Smokey Daniels that many of you may know. The one most used around the country has been Best Practice, Bringing Standards to Life in America's Classrooms. And among the various kinds of work that I've done along with the Writing Project and being in writing classrooms is that I put in a lot of time as a guide for student restorative justice teams and social action teams in Chicago schools. That's been a great joy to me, though it was disrupted by COVID. So, Tonya.
Well, what are we going to discuss today? Let me just add, the three of us have been working together for a number of years. And we have taken time every week, almost every week, I'd say for the last 2.5 years, to talk, discuss, and think about racial literacy and how it interacts in our own spaces. So we're glad to share with you today. So once again, thanks colleagues for being here and allowing me to work with you and vice versa. It's been a real joy. So what are we going to discuss today? Well, the first thing is going to discuss the racial literacy development framework. Then we're going to explore why it's important for administrators to do racial equity work with their teachers. And we're going to explain why we must recognize students for their individual and cultural identities. We must develop practical steps to implement in our schools. And then we'll end with any questions and discussion that you have. So we'll go ahead and get started. The first thing that we'll do is talk about the racial literacy development model. And this framework was developed by Yolanda Seeley Ruiz. And Yolanda is out of Teachers College at Columbia University. And we chose this framework because we believe it really speaks to what we are trying to say and do and how we're trying to interact with the world. And this is a really good review and theoretical framework. So it has really 5 different pieces with a 6th piece that kind of goes all the way through. So it starts with at the bottom critical love, as you can see on your screen, if you can see it on your screen, and then it moves to critical humility, and it goes to critical reflection and historical literacy and then interruption, with archaeology of self always taking place through all of these different layers. So today we're going to really focus on 3, but I wanted to talk a little bit about what this means. when you're really talking about race and racial literacy development, the place you have to start is with critical love. That is the foundation. So it is a profound ethical commitment to caring for communities that we live in. So we have to have this idea of critical love, which is foundational before we can even think about some of the other ways in which we can interrupt. The idea here is that we want to be able to interrupt racism, inequality, both at the personal and systematic levels. But in order for us to do that, we must begin with critical love. Begin to ask ourselves questions about, what is it that I love about this community I work in and with? You know, what is it that I love about this community? What is it that I want to do to help care for this community? That's very important to this work. And then you also must have the critical humility. And the critical humility is more about stepping outside of yourself and then being able to really look at the people that you work with and that you serve, not just through your own perspective, but looking at their perspective as well. Sometimes this can be difficult because sometimes our own perspective is the one that is the at the forefront, and it's hard to put our perspective to the side because sometimes we think that our perspective is the perspective. The truth is that critical humility teaches us that our perspective is not the only perspective. There are multiple perspectives, and so we have to be humble and sit back and think, what could this look like from someone else's eyes? How is it that I can approach this that may be different? How is it that I might not use the approach that I might want to use to do this, but some other approach that might be culturally responsive or maybe more open for other groups? Even though it makes me uncomfortable, it might be a better way to address this and for me to become a part of the community or be able to listen and learn. That's a hard pill to swallow sometimes. And then the third one is critical reflection. So when we think about critical reflection, we're also thinking about how to think about something using our own experiences, but we're also looking at the experiences of other people, but we're really digging deep into ourselves. So when we think about critical reflection, we have to think about, as it says here on this sheet, what is it that I need to do to think about the various layers of my identity, the identities of the people I'm working with, the privilege that I have, and how is it that it affects the group of people or the community or the families I'm working with, right? What is my own privilege? What is it here that I have? What kind of power do I have here? How is it playing here? Is it allowing for everyone to have a voice, or am I coming off too strong? And am I coming off, is it too much? And then how can I step back? How can I reflect on who I am and how I come to the table so that other people have a chance to show up too? So, but that's deep, because that reflection is very, sometimes very grounded in who we are. And we just sometimes say, that's just who I am. But and get rid of that language, that's who I am, and just think about, if I could do something differently, reflect on that. If I could do something differently, what would it be? And how could that be something that would help my students, my school, my teachers, my community grow? If I just did something just a little differently, how can I reflect on that and be able to enact that? So these are the areas that we're talking about today: critical love, critical humility, and critical reflection.
So, as you can probably tell from what Tonya was saying, the three of us really do believe that all of this work starts with ourselves. And that as the adults in the building, if we're going to serve our students, if we're going to serve the kids, we have to engage in the excavation and the archaeology of our own perspectives so that we can then support those of the young people we serve. The adults need to step up, and as school leaders, right, administrators and other types of school leaders, we set the tone by stepping up ourselves. The three of us, along with other teachers, with young people, with colleagues in a variety of different settings, have been trying to engage in some of this work extensively over the past 3+ years. Along with the work that came, we've built as part of our careers even before now. In thinking about our own experiences and our own levels of equity development, racial literacy development, equity in all of its forms, and especially in its forms around racial literacy. What privileges might we have benefited from? What inequities might we recognize in our colleagues and in the folks with whom we work? One of the strategies that we have done ourselves and tried out with lots of other folks that we would recommend to all of you is to create a timeline of the experiences that you've had that have been really profoundly important to you, and then take a step back and look at those experiences that you've had to examine how those events may have been influenced by the privileges that you've experienced or the inequities that you've experienced. Where in your life has race played a role in the privileges or inequities that you have faced? This is something we can ask our colleagues to do, we can ask kids to do. Then sharing those stories of ourselves, our biographies with one another can help us to recognize our own positionality. And it also brings us closer together with the people with whom we share. To engage in this kind of work with a faculty in a school would certainly take more than one PD session, right? It would not be something that you would want to try to accomplish completely in one institute day. And I will say for myself, having had the opportunity to engage over and over and over in these conversations with these colleagues whom you see today, as well as our other colleagues, has made this work incredibly meaningful for me. What we think is that this is work that could be done over the course of a school year or over the course of several school years to build a culture in the school of equity-minded professional development, of equity-minded practice. And so I want to share with you an example of this kind of shared work between two teachers that we have worked with, and then think a little bit together about how that could come to life in over the course of a school year. And so two of the teachers that we've worked with, Christopher and Vanessa, engaged in this timeline practice together. And so what you see on the screen is an excerpt from Christopher's timeline. At first, when Christopher and Vanessa met, they each of them has said, I didn't think I'd have anything in common with that person, right? Because Christopher is here from Chicago. He's a CPS teacher. He's an African-American man. And Vanessa is teaching in California in a rather privileged district. She is a white woman. And they're like, okay, on the surface, doesn't look like we have much in common. But once they created their timelines and then shared them with one another, one of the things that they recognized is that, oh, wow, look, both of us earlier on, you can in their timelines and in their bios, they talked about the fact that as kids, they had moved frequently. Okay, their parents and their family situations were such that they moved around quite a lot. Early in their elementary years, each of them was chosen for honors or accelerated classes in their elementary school. And both of them shared their hijinks, their misbehaviors that they had experienced in their schooling life, that in many ways led them to want to become teachers so that they could work with the kids who had some of the same kinds of experiences that they had had. What they also found was that the consequences of their misbehaviors, their hijinks in schools were very different. Christopher, as you can see on his timeline, shared that, he had come back, he had skipped school to go out to lunch, had come back late. And as a result, he was expelled from school. Vanessa talked about having skipped school, come back late, and being told, oh, just don't do that again. And that conversation, that part of their conversation, really helped each of them to investigate and to think more deeply about how the privilege of race benefited Vanessa, as well as perhaps the privilege of gender in this case. And so this shared experience led each of them to they say each of them to some personal and professional growth in thinking about how they could better serve their own students whose experiences had been similar to or different from their own. In a professional development setting, right, in an institute setting, we might find that one day in an institute, we could have teachers, we could have our staff write their timelines. And then maybe over the course of a year, people could take 5 minutes as kind of a bell ringer, right? Or a startup for some other professional development work where they could share some of their information, enabling the staff then to get to know one another and to be thinking together about how as a staff, we can enact more and more equitable practices to serve our kids. These are also activities that each of these teachers has tried with their own students, right? And so Steve is going to talk more about other things that we can do with the young people to recognize their identities and their experiences.
Before we get to mine, I'm just going to add about Christopher and Vanessa, because we've known the two of them for quite a while now, and now they know each other, and they discovered that they had a lot in common. They are both very kind of edgy, kind of get sarcastic. They like to, they're wisecracker. They're kind of the wisecrackers of our team. And so they have a lot in common. And also, I think a piece of this too was discovering for Vanessa, it's not that privilege is a bad thing, not something to feel guilty about. It's simply the fact of where she grew up. And in fact, Christopher had some advantages too. His parents, because he was making so much trouble, were constantly finding activities to try to, help him grow. And so he had parents who were really, trying to help him grow as a young person. But he certainly got a lot he outsmarted them in many ways, I got to tell you. So, but they are now the best of buddies. And so now they can work together. And I think that's really what we're talking about here, because, I'm moving on now to working on students' identities. But what we're saying is, teachers really need to be able to think about themselves and take account of who they are and how that influences the way they relate to students, because it's going to influence their relationship no matter what. Vanessa's students love her wisecracking personality, and it's part of what she uses in her teaching. So, but what we're saying here is that students, to honor and appreciate and value students is really important in their learning. And we want to be very clear about why that's so important. And I say this especially because there's a tendency for people who are questioning some of these efforts to think that they can be divisive, that focusing on people's identities that are different separates them. But that has not been our experience, and that's been the case with Vanessa and Christopher. That it brings them together. It brings them to appreciate and understand one another. And so there are a number of reasons why helping students by letting them know that you are learning who they are and helping them understand more deeply who they are, that this is important. So one concept is what's called windows and mirrors. Many of you may have heard this term before. It comes, I think, originally articulated by teacher scholar Rudine Sims Bishop. And windows are the learning that students have when they are looking out at the world, in history, in math, in science, in literature. And mirrors are when they are learning more about themselves by seeing themselves reflected in the people that they are learning about. And of course, this can be in literature, it can certainly be in history, but it can be in science. Kids realizing, Christopher points out as a chemistry teacher, he asks kids, what do you think a scientist looks like? And they talk about a white guy in a white coat. And then he says, look at me, I'm a scientist. I have worked in science labs. Do I look like that? So, windows and mirrors are important. Along with that, when students feel recognized, and there's been research on this, they really begin to develop a sense of belonging, that school is a place for them, that school connects with their lives. And when they see this, they become much more committed to learning themselves, and they learn more as a result. And of course, when students are writing, doing their timelines and then sharing them, and by the way, another way of doing this, well, I'll be talking about it in a minute, is a lot of elementary teachers use collages. Students bring pictures of all kinds of things from home, and those get put up out in the hall. But what's important is for them to see each other's, so that they are hearing and learning about each other, and they develop respect for one another, and they can support each other's learning, which can be really important in the classroom, so that students are helping and not just feeling like they're competing to who's strong and who isn't in their learning. And then finally, as this is happening, the teacher is going to gain lots of information about who those students are. And that way they can better teach to their strengths, celebrate their strengths, and also understand their learning needs. And we have another teacher who's really not kind of an example today, Tina, discovered that she didn't understand why it was that students would care about reading and what reading they cared about. And once she asked them and started learning that, she could do much more to really motivate their reading. These are ways of thinking about this, ways of preparing teachers, but then getting to the practical matter of classrooms. And while it's teachers doing that, the more school leaders know these things and can encourage teachers and do some of it themselves, then the more that students' identities are going to be recognized, valued, and made a part of their learning. So I want to start by re-emphasizing the timelines and biographies, because there's so much there that can really make a difference. It's, lots of times teachers will say, especially if they're math or science teachers, they'll say, well, this is great for English class, but how can I do this? And I have so much to cover. But Christopher really showed us how initiating hands-on collaborative activity not only gets kids involved, but it gives the teacher a chance to watch for who those kids are, how they behave, how they relate to each other, and what makes them tick. I mean, he has an activity at the beginning of the year for chemistry where kids have to really collaborate to figure out who has the test tube with a chemical that's infecting all the other test tubes. And of course, the kids get really involved in this and they can get excited about chemistry, but he is watching every minute to try to learn who they are. I want to emphasize in this that, in fact, in a meeting of some of our writing project people last night, teachers feel so squeezed for time to add activities because the curriculum is so crowded. And they often feel like, well, that sounds great, but I don't have time to have kids make these timelines and write their biographies and share them. How can I do that? And so, especially in our Illinois Writing Project, what we've tried to encourage teachers to do, and that Christopher did, by the way, in activities that we have observed and then described in our book, that you can look at the activity that you are having students do and crosswalk that with your list of standards, with Illinois standards in our case, and ask yourself, what are standards that are actually being covered? Obviously, there are writing standards. There are research standards in the timelines that are being covered, and this can save time elsewhere in the curriculum. So it's really important to be able to answer teachers who very understandably feel like they're awfully overwhelmed. We don't want to blame them. We just want to understand their situation and help them to deal with it. So those are some of the strategies, and now I'm turning it over to Katy for more.
So another strategy that was shared with me first by James Bean, B-E-A-N-E, is a strategy around wonderings. A wonderful teacher in Madison, Wisconsin, Barb Brodhagen, who happens to be Jim's wife, used this strategy with her fifth graders to help them outline what the curriculum would be for their whole year's worth of work. Now, we'll talk about how that might or might not be able to work for all of the rest of us. Nonetheless, it is a strategy that as a classroom teacher I used, and that as a teacher of graduate students I still use. And so the strategy goes this way. We start by asking the students, we can give them a card or give them a piece of paper or have them pull up a piece of paper. And the way I introduce it is, we're going to play this like a game of Jeopardy, right? You're going to write your questions, everything in the form of a question. And so we're going to start this way. I want you to brainstorm all the things that you wonder, questions that you might have about yourself. Okay, things you wonder about yourself, or maybe about others like you. Right, and then give the audience, give the students, give the teachers, give the group a few minutes to brainstorm some questions. Okay, then the next question that I ask is, all right, so you've thought about some things about yourself. Now let's zoom out a little bit, and I'm going to ask you to write down all the questions that you have, things that you wonder about your community or the communities that you're a part of. Now, community can mean lots of things. It can mean your neighborhood. It could mean your place of worship. It could mean our classroom. It could mean your school. Or if you're a fan of Star Wars, it could be the community of Star Wars fans, right? But what are some things that you wonder about your community? Okay, time, right. Question. And then finally, we're going to zoom out even farther, and I want you to write down all the things that you wonder about the world writ large, about the world as a whole. What are some of the things that are your wonderings about the world? Okay. After the class or the students or the colleagues have spent this time writing, depending on your group, okay, depending on the group of students that I've worked with, sometimes I'll have them turn and talk to a partner. Sometimes I'll have them get into small groups. And if it's a class of students that I know from their cue cards or something else that they don't know one another, I might just collect their cards, right? And then feed back to them, write up and feed back to them the lists of questions that they have. Now, for me as a teacher, this activity always provides me with a lot of information about what it is that is important to the young people in my class. Okay, what is it that they are concerned about and care about? As a teacher, it also provides me with a whole lot of information about how I can connect my existing curriculum again, the standards that we need to meet, right? How can I connect the existing curriculum to the things that my students are really interested in and caring about? It gives me information about, oh, this person's really interested in this, and so is that one. Maybe I need to get them together so that maybe they'd be a good pair to work with one another in some kind of a collaborative activity. And the other thing that I have found over and over and over again, and that Barb describes in having done this with younger students, is that so many of the questions already connect to the work that were going to be part of my classroom anyway, right? It connects to the things that I was supposed to teach anyway. And in the meantime, it helps affirm the students' identities, because much of I can connect it directly to the things that they were caring about. Okay, so again, another strategy that you might be able to take back to your school or to your classroom. So, Tonya, can you talk a little bit about extending and deepening this kind of work?
Thanks, Katie. So there are two other things that we'll talk about today. And one is talking about interruption alerts for equity questions or inquiries. So let's talk about most of our classes, if not all of our classes, in some way can use the interruption alerts. It relates to when you're reading something, whether it's fiction or nonfiction, being able to use the alerts so that you can help students think about their own thinking and how they can interrupt patterns. So, for example, there are 5 interruption alerts. One interruption alert is a time to report and speak. That happens sometimes in our lives, right? And then sometimes it's letting it go. A third would be when silence is compliance. A 4th alert is giving voice to others. And a 5th alert is part of the problem or part of the solution. So as we read a text, let's say in class, like I said, it could be nonfiction or fiction. Let's say it's a history lesson, or it could be a science lesson. And you're reading about something in the text or how something was used, such as the cells for Henrietta Lacks, or let's say that you're reading about a mathematician, or you're reading something about history. You can have the students interact, using sticky notes if you prefer, to be able to talk to the text. So, or even just a piece of literature. So what happens when silence is compliance, right? What happens, let's say, if you're reading the history of Henrietta Lacks, and you know that for her cells, she was a Black woman who was used in science. And even today, we are benefiting from the science that she gave to us, but she didn't know that she was doing this, right? It was against what we would call the Hippocratic oath, right? It was not something that was it was doing harm. And she used the scientist or the doctor used her cells for experimental purposes. That's just the background. So if you're reading something like that, and we want the students to be able to read through the text or the passage, they could probably use an interruption alert. Maybe one of it is when silence is compliance. Maybe there were people who were involved in this who didn't say anything, but just allowed it to happen. And they could put in that passage where they say, ooh, they were silent. They didn't interrupt here. That might be a problem here. And they can use that as an alert. The same way with any of the others. Maybe somebody in the text is part of the problem and not part of the solution, right? Or maybe somebody is part of the solution. We can put an interrupter or a sticky note there so that they're interacting with the text, and they can say, oh, okay, this is somebody who's really trying to work this out. Oh, this is somebody who's really adding to the problem. But this helps students think about interrupting. What is it that they're doing to interrupt the practices that are there? So this is what we're talking about, interruption alerts for equity questions and inquiries. And I hope that you like or find a way that you can use these in some way. Hold on just a second. Okay, and then the second one is extending lessons to include active learning that's tied to the community that promotes equity. So there are times in which we really want students to be tied to the community, really care about the community, really have that critical love for the community. But how do we do that? You know, how do we tie students to the world and have them want to contribute and think about what happens in the world and how it relates to them and how they can impact their own world? Well, in the book, we have some examples of students. So the book that we have here, we've been together, we have teacher writers, and then we have students who've contributed as well. And we have students who talk about how they can make a difference in the world and how being an interrupter was important to the work that they have done. And one in particular, Jordan is a social justice warrior. And so she was able to promote diversity at her school, but she had to interrupt some practices that were usual. And I would say that, for example, she was in her school and she tried to have other people, she tried to have a workshop for her school and her schoolmates and teachers. And when she did that, most of the people, if not all the people she invited, were African American. However, her school had never had a team of people come in who were African American to do this workshop or this particular day. And then one of the persons involved in the planning that she had to work with asked, "Why is everyone here African American?" And the question was back to from Jordan's standpoint, but she didn't say it, but her parents did. You know, you never said this when everybody was white. Right? So this idea here of being an interrupter and thinking about our own practices, kids being tied to things that make a difference to them and being able to raise very deep and interesting questions, even to us as adults, is important because we want to extend and deepen this work. And we can do this in lots of different ways. And my colleagues can add to this as well. You know, how do we do this work? How do we get kids tied to this work? And so I'll turn it back over to you two as well.
Well, I would add that that Katy's activity, we had used that wondering activity with students at the Best Practice High School that we had created and no longer exists, sadly, in Chicago, thanks to politics of Chicago. But we had like a whole sophomore class meet together and do the brainstorming. And then that became those questions, at least selections of the questions that the students had posed, became the basis for research projects that students did. And I think it's important to not only do the wondering and the questioning, but then make use of it.
Yes.
If you don't, you know, students are going to feel like, well, he was pretending like he cared about what I'm interested in, but not enough to make time for it, you know. So I think that having a way to make use of it, and if it connects with things that are already in the curriculum, great, but make sure that students see that.
Right.
And the way Christopher did that with he didn't start wide open, but he built it around the Flint water crisis, and there were chemistry lessons that had to be in there so students could understand even why it happened. What is it that really went wrong? And but it didn't take much time. He didn't have to tell them for them to start having questions about the whole thing. And then when they discovered that there were issues with the water here in Chicago, they were all running home and talking to their parents and saying, we got to find out what's going on in our house. So the connections were very deep. It was a great example of making this happen in a chemistry class. Katy, I bet you have a story or two as well.
Well, sure. As another example, you know, some of the questions that might come out of that that middle part, what are the questions you have about your community? Certainly in a structured way, that opportunity can lead to the revelation of things that kids are wondering about their own community. Sometimes it doesn't even take that, or doesn't even take the structure. For example, I want to mention something that Steve had been involved in. He'd been volunteering in a classroom in an elementary school in Chicago. It is a teacher who was really interested in equity work and interested in social action work. And much of what she was doing was through a club, but much of it also bled over into what was going on in their regular classrooms as well. And so, for example, in that classroom, Betty discovered that some of the kids were asking about, how they could help, because there was a pretty significant homeless population in the neighborhood of their school. And how did that happen? How is it the case that families don't have housing? And so again, there are many pieces that she could pull from that to connect to readings or connect to lessons in the classroom. But it also led to action where the kids they built backpacks that they called them Love You Packs. They asked for donations from area stores. They created and colored on the packs. And I had the privilege of getting to see some of this work. These were elementary kids and then they went and gave these love you bags or love you packs, what they call them, Steve, whatever, to the people who were living in their neighborhood without housing. And so, here's an example of a way that something that was going on in the community was brought into the curriculum. Another example that I can give is from a ninth grade girl in one of my classes a number of years ago. In the community where I was teaching, there had been a TIF referendum, and the funds were going to be used to redevelop a particular area in the community. And Lauren was quite puzzled by that. And so this work, her investigation of that became an individual inquiry project, something that, within the structure of my course, the students had opportunities to do some inquiry work over the course of the year, took care of a lot of the research work that they needed to do, a lot of the written work that they needed to do, a lot of the oral work that they needed to do, oral and speaking standards, because part of this inquiry was that they had to interview people, they had to write letters, they had to do other kinds of things. But her project came out of this worry, this wondering, this interest that she had in why was this part of our town being redeveloped through TIF funds, and was this a worthwhile thing to do or not? I will say that her conclusion was that this particular TIF redistricting was not in the best interest of the community. She ended up presenting to the city board. They did it anyway, but she still did present. So
I think one of the things in this, I can imagine people in our audience thinking, well, these are nice inquiry and research projects, but how does that relate to student identities? But I think the way that it does is not all of the work of student identities is focused on, write something about who you are or learn about the other people in the classroom. It is respecting the things in students' lives that really matter to them, and that in itself is, well, what's great about that is it is supporting their identities, but at the same time it's asking them to do some active learning and inquiry. There's another Another example of that was a high school class in which, well, they were reading House on Mango Street, and there's a particular chapter where the speaker talks about what people think her neighborhood is like and what it's really like. And that inspired the students to write about that for themselves. And then Madeline took another step and arranged for her students to go and lead that activity for 8th graders at a nearby middle school. So that the students that was expanding their sense of identity and who they are, because now they're becoming the experts and the teachers. And so there are a lot of ways in which doing this is equity, even when it doesn't necessarily look like, oh, having a hot discussion about race in your classroom. If that's something that really comes up and is important to you, great, help your kids to do that respectfully. But that's just one little piece of the puzzle. There's lots more that can often connect with what things the teachers are already doing in your building that you can help them to value and realize that it's serving multiple purposes.
And we have a Facebook group, and on the Facebook group, one of the questions that came up recently has been around the text Teaching for Racial Equity. How do you get kids to care about really important issues? And I think we've addressed it here. The idea is that not all the ideas that kids care about have to come externally and then move internally. Things that kids care about can begin internally and move externally, right? Mm-hmm. So this idea of what your own identity, who you are, what's important to you, and then being able to listen to other people critically, ultimately will tie to, sometimes it's around race, sometimes it's around other identities, right? Mm-hmm. But it's important to know that when we can start internally and begin to share who we are and what we care about, then there's more critical love for it that moves externally. See, that when it starts externally and the teacher tells kids what to care about, then we don't always have the buy-in from the students that there is that care. We can try to build that care around literature and experiences and other things. But like Steve talked about with the water in Flint, Michigan, and then examining it in Chicago, there is a real need there for understanding in a real time. And when we start there with what it is that we identify with and care about, then we're able to take this critical love and move it forward to an interruption status, I think. But it's harder when teachers are trying to tell kids what they should care about, as opposed to them discovering it. One other thing we can do is set the context where kids begin to uncover that they care about it. I won't say it's a trick, but maybe it's a trick. Like you can set a classroom up where kids begin to care about the things that you really are setting forth for them, right? In ways in which they can buy into them. So that we don't have to tell them outrightly, you should care about this. We set it up so that they do begin to care, and because they begin to understand. So it was just one thing that came through the Facebook group that I thought we should share today with our audience, is that Teaching for Racial Equity can start internally we start with ourselves, even our students start with themselves, and then we can move more externally. So I'll turn it over to you with the next slide, Steve and Katy.
So we actually had left some time at the end, these last 10 minutes, for participants to put questions in the chat, put ideas in the chat. So because, there's always more knowledge than any 3 or 4 presenters can share. So we would like to invite you all to share your questions, share your ideas into the chat so that we can all benefit from the collective wisdom.
Wonderful. Thank you all so much for those strategies and sharing your expertise on celebrating and honoring these students from different backgrounds. Feel free to thank them in the chat as well. But before we move to the Q&A, I did want to remind the audience that if you'd like to speak on the microphone, it is possible. Typing into the chat works fine, but if you'd like to share out something on the mic, simply raise your hand from the toolbar at the bottom of your screen, and I can enable you to talk on the microphone. You'll be able to unmute yourself. But we've got 9 minutes left of Q&A, so please feel free to type your questions, your comments, your thoughts, your reactions, your thank yous. Feel free to type them into the chat, and we will address them as they come in.
As encouragement, I'd like to add that in the writing project, one of the things we've done in workshops with teachers over the years is, when it comes to this stage, just write the words yes, but up on the, we do this up on the board, you know, because teachers, because this can be challenging work, you know, to fit it into your curriculum, to make some of these projects work, to have the faith that students are, you know, have caring and ideas and concerns within them that you can dig out. And so, you know, if you do not hesitate to challenge us here, I mean, because this is hard work, and there are things that teachers can be up against, especially nowadays, that they may be saying, this sounds great, but I don't want to get in trouble because of all that's going on around us right now. And how do I explain to parents and administrators or our school board why we're doing this? And so we welcome the yes buts.
Okay, great. We do have a participant. Joshua Kaufman's got his hand in the air. Joshua, I'm going to click the button to allow you to talk, and you should be able to unmute yourself now and speak into your microphone.
Great. Can you hear me?
Yes, sounds good, Josh.
Okay. So that sort of encouragement for a yes, but is perfect, because that was to some extent my question. I'm wondering what you would advise to administrators that would like to do this work and yet maybe hesitant because of examples of, like, you know, what's happening in Evanston, Illinois, where a teacher is actually suing the district for doing, it's not exactly what you propose, but work that is, you know, in that vein of sort of DEI and equity work. And so I guess I'm wondering, you know, how you would advise for someone to move forward, and in terms of how they frame and introduce the work to try to sort of cut that type of pushback off at the pass.
Jump in, partners and participants too. I've been thinking about this in terms of the language of No Child Left Behind. No Child Left Behind was inarguable language. Who wants to leave children behind? Nobody wants to leave children behind. We don't want to talk about the negative outcomes that whole, anyway, exposing my own biases here, I suppose. But how can anybody argue with loving and caring about our students and wanting to know who our students are? And so that's the way that I would frame it myself as an administrator and as a community member. You know, to me, it is inarguable that we should care about our students, that we should care about one another, and that can provide a good starting point. Josh, does that help at all?
Well, I'd like to add something here. I was fortunate enough a few years back to spend a few years working on developing a network of schools in Chicago, working with a woman who was a community organizer. And we were driving all over town, had a lot of time to talk in the car. And one of the things that I began to realize as I watched her deal with challenges of various kinds is that community organizers have a whole vocabulary and training in terms of working with communities to promote change, and that one of the tools that's most prized among organizers is what they call one-on-one conferences. And that is sitting down with people one-on-one to discuss things, especially people who might be opposing what you're trying to do, along with your allies. Another strategy that was clearly important in her mind was developing allies and supporters, so that to helping teachers or administrators or anybody understand that if you stand up alone in a meeting to argue for something, and then there's pushback coming from it, and you're alone, you're going to have a hard time. That what you need before you ever do that is what she called what did she call it? A floor team, a bunch of people who are going to second what you're saying, so that the person who is raising the issue realizes, wait a minute, this isn't a person alone just expressing an opinion. There's a whole group of people. I have seen stories in the, I collect a lot of stories about this stuff from the web, and I've sadly seen cases of like principals who really wanted to make big change in their school, and they jumped out in front of it really with nobody along with them. And they paid the price. Teachers started to resist, parents started asking questions, and she was there alone, and principal can end up losing their job from that. And I look at that and think, what would a community organizer advise such a person? She'd say, spend a lot of time. I was, as we would drive around, I would say, Kim, this is taking forever having all these little meetings. And she said, just be patient, it's gonna pay off. You really take what she was doing all the time that I admired was building a base of support. And it took time before she really moved. But then when she did move, the one person or two who are objecting realized that everybody else in the room is on your side. And suddenly they're not so hesitant to take you down. It's sad that so many of us, I had never as a teacher learned those skills. And I had to learn, it was like going back to school, watching Kim operate and realizing, wow, this is a whole way of thinking that I had not appreciated.
So let me piggyback on that, or go back to your first point, Steve, is that coalition building or base building, along with that one-on-one conversation and the one-on-one time, particularly with the opponents, to help build some understanding. It also helps you understand what their opposition is, and if we all want to be heard. And so if the people who are in opposition have an opportunity to be heard, that can help cut that down, while at the same time you're building your base.
I'm looking at my watch. We're running out of time fast. So I could tell more stories of this. Good positive stories too.
Yep.
That are teachers successful at doing one-on-one sit downs with parents.
I just like to say to Joshua, thank you for raising the point. And like my colleague said, I won't reiterate because they did a really good job of explaining too. But really taking time to think about what your community cares about will be important, and then how to frame what you're trying to do. If your community is really interested, invested in success of students getting jobs, but you really need them to know a global market, then that's how you go forward. Our students need to be globally ready and our globe is very diverse, and we want our students to be able to make it in this world. If the focus of your community is making sure that everybody is cared for and everybody feels heard in my community, then you take that stance, and that's how you move forward the curriculum, the things you're trying to move forward, which is our community is a place of care. And therefore, because we care for everyone, everyone is visible. And because everyone is visible, then everyone shows up in our school. And how do we do that? But whatever it is that your community cares about, where you can get your floor team together, I think that's the best way to tackle it strategically about when you're moving forward with curriculum, selection of text, a certain pedagogy. I think you have to look at what your floor team cares about and then how to frame it so you can move forward.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Tonya. And thank you, Katy and Steve, for being our panelists today and sharing your time and expertise on this important topic. It would be great. Yes, if you want to talk just a minute about the book that you've got out here for racial equity, and then we will sign out in just another minute.
Tonya, you want to say something about the book as the lead author?
No.
Oh.
You can take it. Y'all can take it. Take it away, Katy.
Okay, this is, we have recently published this book, Stenhouse Publishing. It is available on Amazon and through Stenhouse and all that stuff. But even more, yes, and we have a Facebook group that you would be able to find. And if you'd like to have more conversation, please come join us. There are a lot of interesting folks who are participating in that Facebook conversation. So we would love to see you there too.
Do you want to post a link to that Facebook group into the chat, Katy? Is that accessible for you?
Let's see if I can get to it here.
It's a group. It's just a group name.
So they would have to
Teaching
search for the name Teaching for Racial Equity.
Okay, then they could join that group and you would approve them.
I guess they asked to join and then Tonya will let them in.
Okay, perfect.
Cool.
Well, thank you all so much. I want to thank our participants today. I will be sending out an email tomorrow with an evaluation link for our Illinois participants. You can get 1 hour of professional development credit for attending today's webinar session in full. And then for those who were not able to attend, they can watch the recording again, which will be available tomorrow. Thank you all so much. You are free to hover down in the lower right-hand corner of your screen and click Leave Webinar. Thanks, everyone.